this exhibit and through the context for the exhibit as I'm familiar with it, so much of what I wanted to cram into tonight won't fit because there is so much really rich heritage of women in art that I feel like Jessica Caldas draws on consciously and subconsciously in her work, that I really encourage you, if you have the time at all, if you haven't been, to come see, even if you have been, to come see the work again next door. And since they're holding it open for us, it's a special, extra special treat. But let's actually begin, I guess, why we're here. In addition to that, so the title of the talk is "The Personal is Still Political." And the slogan, "The Personal is Political," was in the 1960s associated with the feminist movement. And although not all of the artists would associate themselves with that label of feminist artists today, we're looking at women who are dealing with that message of the personal and political. And one of those women is Jessica Caldas. And we're gonna look at some older examples of that, if I can avoid moving at breakneck speed. So, in trying to organize this, Professor Tomengo is an amazing colleague, but he has asked me to take an entire semester-long course and condense it to about 40 minutes. So he may be less excellent than he was before this invitation. And ultimately, I had to decide how to pare down so many of these people. And the first thing I thought of, because I was so moved and inspired by everything Jessica Caldas did, was that entry piece of these three incredible graces. And the three of her tired bodies that are in that entryway are, I think, the first of many sort of breathtaking moments as you walk through this exhibit. And they relate, I think, in some ways to that, sorry, I'm being terrible about staying near the microphone. Can you hear me when I'm not right up on the microphone? Is that okay? Oh, good. Please let me know if I'm cutting in and out like a delinquent. But if you look at those three strands, those three representations of women, women are so often represented in these three ages, right, as well. This idea that there's a maiden, a mother, and then what's sometimes called the crone, and understandably people have objected to that title and sometimes replaced it with sage, because no one wants to be called a crone no matter how much it's reclaimed, I believe. But using that idea of this sort of gorgeous trio, I've pulled out three strands for you in terms of examining a history of women in art that I feel Caldas' work really embodied. The first of those are the women who have worked to accommodate the sort of prejudices about women in art and tried to stay within certain gendered norms. In some cases, this is a choice artistically to try to get ahead, and in other cases, they end up staying within those norms because they're crammed into them and certainly pushing at those boundaries. So to pull in some examples of that, the first I have for you are women who are part of the art world that are deeply influenced by family ties. So the first example of that is Katsushika Oi, who is the daughter of the famous Japanese printmaker Hokusai. And I'm guessing most of you are familiar with the Great Wave, the Japanese print. Well, his daughter, in fact, all of his daughters, and he had several, were part of his artistic workshop. And as part of the artistic workshop, they were all uncredited assistants. And this is something we see globally with women of art, that often they're required to get their training from men who are part of their family because they can't belong to an apprenticeship system if it's not family, since that would mean time alone unchaperoned with a strange man. And since we certainly can't have that impinging on our virtue, it's often family teaching. Now, Oi has an interesting story, and we know more about her than the other daughters because she notoriously married a fellow artist and allegedly divorced him within several months because she spent so much time making fun of his art. Literally, she told him he was not as good as her father in a deeply Freudian situation, and was laughing at his works, and they ended their marriage, and she spent the rest of her life working as her father's assistant and producing her own work. And we have, as I said, many examples of this where sometimes we can't tell what is in fact Katsushika Oi's work and what is her father's. Tintoretto's daughter, famously similar situation, right? So when we do have works, they're particularly precious, and we know that he highly praised his daughter's skill and ability to paint women as a woman, but her connection to art is familial. In other cases, this is a marriage family connection. So the French Impressionist Berthe Morisot, this is one of the highest paid paintings produced by a woman. It went for almost $11 million at the beginning of this century, and everyone was very excited. I have a student, sorry Nisha, I have a student from my gender course, and at first we just discussed this painting last week, and everyone said, oh, $11 million. And then we talked about the top selling paintings of all time, and we realized unless your work goes for over 50, you don't even make the list. And we said, oh, 11 million just became a lot less impressive. But that was this particular work, Après le déjeuner. And Morisot married a French doctor, but are any of you all familiar with her brother-in-law? So I'm treating this like a class too much and not like a lecture. I apologize, professional hazard. Edouard Manet. Manet was her brother-in-law. And we have a number of other artists who made connections with in-laws, or who sometimes had brothers-in-laws who supported them so they could devote themselves to their work financially. So we have a number of fascinating situations like those. And certainly in the Caldas work, things like the matriarch timeline, there's this strong emphasis on family and its role in women's lives, personal, professional, and political. Within gendered norms, we also see incredible examples of women sticking to certain themes. So one of those themes is portraiture, because women are expected to be private, to exist primarily inside the home. Small portraits of women and other children, because again, we don't need to be alone with men, unchaperoned, are going to be a specialization. And here we have an artist, an Italian artist, Sofonisba Anguissola, who we know Michelangelo praised and Caravaggio actually imitated one of her works. She's an exceptional painter who was hired away from Italy by the King of Spain, Philip II, and painted the royal children and Philip's second wife. However, when she completed a portrait of Philip himself, she crossed a line and went from popular court artist to social pariah. And eventually he helped arrange a marriage and get her back to Italy, because it was assuming that if she spent that much time alone with the king in tights, naughty things happened. So there's the dangers of venturing outside the accepted realms of portraiture. Probably one of my favorites and one of the most famous, Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun, another example of a formidable female artist whose father was an artist, in fact, as well. Vigée-Lebrun, of course, famous for her paintings of Marie Antoinette. She completed more than 30 of these, and unfortunately, she picked the wrong patroness, because I don't think any of you need to be told what happened to Marie Antoinette. And in order to avoid a similar fate, I'm afraid she ended up leaving France during the Revolution and spending her life pawning her skills on the road through various European royal courts to make a living and escape political pressure. So women who venture too close to the edge of portraiture potentially being penalized, but sticking to themes that are associated with the feminine. Similarly, still lifes were acceptably private, and still life works, although certainly there are a number of accomplished Dutchmen in the golden age of painting who produced incredible floral pieces. We have women who did the same thing. This was seen as an acceptable topic for a woman, particularly because it's not going to be the heart of a government building, showing a large politician in, say, an equestrian pose, tight trousers. We have Maria van Oosterwijk, who was not permitted to charge guild prices because of her gender, and seen as particularly suspicious because she didn't marry. And Rachel Rush, who got much more praise because she did marry, and in fact produced her exceptional work while raising 10 children, which, fair enough, but she got incredible congratulations for that. I think just bearing 10 children's is 10 children's, oh dear. But a fairly monumental achievement, let alone holding down a career in the process. And she was in fact permitted to join a guild, although this couldn't part have been because her husband was also an artist. Interestingly, she outsold him and became the family breadwinner. So if Caldas stays with a number of feminine themes, in particular, I think her color choice and her textile choices are very much playing with traditional feminine arts and stereotypes of femininity, those rich pinks and reds and purples. One of the other things she does, which I find particularly interesting, is that she challenges the traditional notion of fine art, which before the 20th century was incredibly provocative and continues to be, in many ways, provocative. So one of the places we see a number of women working, and one of the reasons they're not initially recognized as fine artists, is because textiles often form part of their production. This is a tapestry piece done by Günther Stölzel, and she was one of the women involved with the Bauhaus School of Architecture outside of Dessau in Germany. And we know that the female staff, when funds ran low, were expected to go without wages because it was assumed they weren't supporting families, so they didn't need a paycheck. We also know they were systematically devalued in histories of Bauhaus until about really 20 years ago. They started being rewritten back into that narrative. But I think it's hard to imagine the Bauhaus vision of abstraction and modernism being part of the daily life without envisioning the sort of tapestries that are produced during this period. And certainly they did incredible educational work at the architectural school in things like weaving. And ultimately were, just like the architects, many cases refugees from Nazi Germany's persecution of modern art. So here's a highly educated female artist and professor, but we also have a number of women who did not have academy educations. This is particularly true for women of color, and this is where we begin to see more and more discussion of intersectionality. So in case this isn't a concept you're familiar with intersectionality, the same way we have a road intersection, right? We have gender crossing paths with other elements of women's identities and existence. And of course, this can be race, nationality, ability, sexuality, any number of elements of identity. And Harriet Powers is one of the few surviving enslaved women whose artwork we're able to put a name to. And in a time when it was literally illegal for these women to learn to read and write because of laws forbidding that, although we know Harriet Powers did ultimately achieve literacy, which actually was found out by a biographer, fairly recently. Harriet Powers produced 2 incredible applique quilts. She was an enslaved woman from Georgia for the first part of her life. She was a woman from Georgia all of her life. But she was enslaved the first part of her life and ultimately freed after the Civil War. She produced these quilts for family and friends, but they were widely admired and shown at local fairs. And ultimately, when she ran into financial trouble, we know she was forced to sell them, and she didn't particularly want to, which is actually incredibly moving and fairly tragic. But what's amazing about this is because of the circumstances under which they were sold, we know the identity of the person who made them instead of a museum tag that says anonymous slave quilt. And these incredible quilts, in this case, the pictorial quilt tells not just a number of Bible stories, some of which, like the man being eaten by a giant fish, you may be able to solve for yourself. But it tells stories of things like a local meteor shower that she makes a record of. And one of the really important and vibrant things about the history of quilting and women's art, particularly documenting the lives of African American women, is that we know that besides being moving examples of art, these were also narrative records in a community with limited or no access to literacy, and that these were oftentimes signs of resistance because they could be hung on washing lines and actually even provide things like paths to escape and maps with clues that could communicate to other enslaved individuals. So this is not something that is usually ranked among oil paintings initially, but thankfully that's beginning to change in the art world. Similarly, another woman of color who ends up being sort of mislabeled in terms of fine art, not getting credit, the absolutely amazing Pueblo potter Maria Martinez, who pioneered the black on black style from the San Ildefonso Pueblo in New Mexico, was an outstandingly successful ceramicist who came up not only with the first way to do this black on black, incredibly glossy work, but actually earned so much in the early 20th century that she famously had one of Santa Fe, New Mexico's first cars, which apparently she painted black on black, just like her pottery. And I have looked for a photo, I have not found one. It would definitely be in this PowerPoint. But when you go to see Maria Martinez's work today, you're more often than finding it celebrated among the innovative modern pottery, going to find this indigenous woman's work in anthropological specimens, even though she's an incredible modern artist. So again, not credited as the incredible fine art that it is. Ultimately, one of the things I think that was so gripping to me when we went through the gallery was seeing a video that was provided of Jessica Caldas actually sitting there at a sewing machine with her hair thrown up late at night, making one of these incredibly huge, beautiful works of art. And the idea of how many women through the generations have sat and sewn, and how much this is part of women's often uncredited labor, and how this is part of reclaiming women's tradition of participation in the arts, was another one of those three threads for me. Besides traditional sort of feminine colors and notions, this idea of reclaiming women's work as being worthy of acceptance and promotion in the artistic community was deeply moving. The third strand, I've promised not to create a hostage situation by keeping you here all evening, so we'll continue moving. The third strand is that there's also an element of rebellion against gender norms. And although they were often penalized for this, there's certainly an incredible tradition in women in art of rebelling against those norms. You might argue that being a woman in the arts is just rebelling against those norms. But some push the envelope as far as possible. And this could be talking about subjects as diverse as sex, violence, anything intellectual. This can be talking about the classics. This can be talking about, in the 20th century, abstraction, which is still seen, right, as suspiciously intellectual by a number of people. You have the, oh no, my 5-year-old could draw that, so it can't be art. I don't understand conceptual art. You have individuals discussing the undiscussable. And on the flyer, joyously put Artemisia Gentileschi's Judith beheading Holofernes. And one of the things that's fantastic about this, if we'd had several hours, we could have spent time looking at this. There are many, many images of Judith beheading Holofernes in art. It's a wonderful biblical tale from the Apocrypha, or the Deuterocanonical texts, whichever you prefer to call them. And Judith famously cuts off the Assyrian general's head to save her people. What's lovely about it is that many previous artists show Judith in a way that's very delicate. My personal favorite, Botticelli, has her strolling off after the event, swinging his head by the hair like a picnic basket, very casually. And one of the things that's so fascinating about Artemisia is that she's got muscle power, and she is straining, and you get the sense that someone thought about how much work it is to cut through the bone and tissue associated with the neck. So ultimately, the famous legend around this painting, which of course we're not 100% able to substantiate, is that the face of Judith is Artemisia's face, and that Holofernes' face was that of Agostino Tasso. Because we do know that Tasso assaulted Artemisia while they were both working in her father Orazio's workshop. And she testified in court. We have the court records describing this. And in fact, she was required to endure thumb screws so that she could tell the truth under torture, and that way she meant it, that he had apparently sexually assaulted her. Said he would fix it by marrying her and then leaving her, which is salt in the wound, right? So we cannot completely, as we said, prove this, but I think the muscular and violent nature of the painting is what makes it so distinct from other Judith, and what makes Artemisia so famously provocative to this day. Artemisia had a recent giant retrospective at the National Gallery in London. And at that exhibit, one of the quotes they put on the wall was from a letter she wrote to a patron, where they're negotiating prices, and she says, "I'll show you what a woman can do." Would have been much nicer if she had the head-hacking painting attached to that. But certainly, she's dealing with uncomfortable themes of sex and violence in a period where this is outrageous for a woman to do. And whether or not this shows evidence of her own sexual assault survival story, Artemisia Gentileschi is telling the story of Judith, who attempted to seduce Holofernes before murdering him. So the sexual elements, the large bed, is certainly mixed in there. Now, Käthe Kollwitz is a German artist who's a personal favorite. And it's another great example of mixing violence with an intimately personal story. Because Kollwitz, as an early 20th century, well, first a late 19th century German woman, was deeply involved in politics from the very beginning. She did woodcut prints and mass-produced images that were anti-war, that spoke out against poverty, that dramatically dealt with the assassination of left-wing politicians. She was incredibly vocal. And it's no coincidence that mass production was one of her favorite means of creation. But I chose to give you her statues here because certainly this combines her personal and political beliefs in a unique way. This is from one of the German war dead cemeteries in Belgium. And when Kollwitz created her abstract statues, this one was perhaps one of the most intensely personal, because her son died in Belgium in the First World War, one of her 2 children, and the grieving parents are representations of herself and her husband. And with the simple lines showing them absolutely curling in on themselves, together in their grief, but separate on their own plinths, it's an incredible statement from a woman whose famous reproduced prints say things like, "Nie wieder Krieg," right? Never again war. This is a very passionately personal statement of those beliefs, the same way Artemisia's can be associated with her own assault. Moving into women who started to make political headway, I've put an Augusta Savage head sculpture here. This is John Henry from the Boston Museum. Oh, it's just one museum of fine arts, although it's a large one. Sorry about that. The Boston Museum of Fine Arts has John Henry because the one seen most often is the gamin, the street urchin, at the Smithsonian. But I think it's significant that she chose to represent John Henry. And Augusta Savage, as an African-American woman who was an active part of the Harlem Renaissance, and from Green Cove Springs up the road, was an incredible example of a pioneering gender rebel, simply because of the intersection of race and gender, but beyond that, because so few women were allowed to involve themselves in sculpture, which was seen as much too intensely physical for a woman to do competently. And this makes Savage especially unique. But beyond that, she's a gender rebel because she's doing pioneering things with reestablishing beauty norms and making representations of beautiful and classical, in many cases, although she'll also do modern poses, of men, women, and children in the African American community in her work. So she's challenging who belongs in museums. And one of the things I think I admire most about Augusta Savage is that of all the women that we talk about in Gender Rebels, more than any other, I think she built her life around her creed because she opened a community center where she offered art classes and believed in genuinely teaching everyone else to share into art and making it accessible across class, race, and gender lines, including very famously actually giving art lessons to Jacob Lawrence's wife one night. Side note I promised I wouldn't take. So a formidable presence. Probably her most famous sculpture is a collection of human beings and a beautiful harp that was later melted down for the scrap metal worth. And we didn't put that up because you don't need me to Hulk out on the microphone. So Alma Thomas is also up here because, first of all, she's one of my favorite abstract artists. And I absolutely hate showing abstract artists on projection slides because they're so radically different in person. The texture, the light, the vibrancy of the painting makes it an entirely different experience than when it's flat on a screen. So many of Alma Thomas's paintings absolutely shimmer in person in a way a projection cannot do, unfortunately. But her work is absolutely stunning, and I would say in maybe the last 10 years there's been a real renewal of interest in her, which I am so excited about. But Alma Thomas is also up here, not just because she is a woman who is dealing with abstract art, which is often supposed to be far too intellectual for a woman's wee little pea brain to process. But in addition to this, Alma Thomas was a vital part of the movement to desegregate the galleries in the Washington, D.C. area, which once again means I think she's living her credo of making art accessible to everyone. And there's a selflessness about these two artists who give back so much to the community that I particularly respect and admire. And Alma Thomas, we know, was particularly active later in her life after a teaching career. A fascinating woman. So ultimately, Jessica Caldas sort of, I'm assuming you can tell, blew my mind with room after room of absolutely exceptional work. And if these were the three strands, the strong femininity of her pieces, the fascination with women's work and this heritage of sewing, and the radical nature of talking about her personal struggles as a sexual assault survivor, the incredible nature of her relationship with her sister, with her community, with her mother, their shared stories. Something very radical about exposing those things, and then at the end, sharing some of the literature that had informed her personal belief systems as a result of those, the things that made her such an incredibly productive individual. Possibly one of the most moving, and I remember all of us feeling, maybe this was just me, I remember feeling very choked up about this, but there was a huge piece, which you will see in here, which had been a tired body that was shared with the Georgia community, and ultimately that community did not initially appreciate the gift and defaced it and vandalized it and cut this body to pieces. And instead of throwing in the towel, she carried those pieces through the community. She spoke about the purpose of the project, and she rebuilt it. And that piece, besides being a moving story of her resilience as an artist and as a human being, is now shown here at the Art Center so beautifully, because the way it's staged, it almost curls in on itself. We said like intestines, like guts. And there's this element of guts, this element of being so visceral, so much an inner part of a person on display, talking about putting all your vulnerability in the limelight, that I can't think of a more powerful statement to make. I think this is what makes her the perfect bridge between this history of women who were artists and the move in the late 20th century towards artists that are much more visibly activists. Augusta Savage and Alma Thomas are starting that tradition, and getting much more personal, we see these later artists. Two of them who are going to become sort of, I guess, writers of their own matriarch timelines are Faith Ringgold, who created a number of her own absolutely stunning modern quilts. But instead of a quilt, this is actually one of my favorite Faith Ringgold pieces, because the sunflower quilting bee at Arles shows a sort of roll call of revolutionary Black women from history doing this quilting, and it's putting their incredible achievements on a par, of course, with one of the most famous male Western artists of all time, Vincent van Gogh, and it's a beautiful juxtaposition. Similarly, famously revolutionary work at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, Judy Chicago's Dinner Party. We've even got it in a fabulously mid-20th century womb-shaped triangle here. It's going to create a sort of banquet of honor for famous women in politics, art, and literature, with special customized vulva place settings, no less, to which I can say part of this is revolutionary and part of this is perhaps in the context of the time period. But certainly groundbreaking work by an artist who's still very much vibrant and active, discussing who her inspirational people were. And certainly there's even more names on the tablecloth going all around this insanely incredible piece. Well, if there are folks actively discussing that matriarch timeline concept, you also have more and more folks who, like Jessica Caldas, have survived incredible experiences that are both personal and political, because they're part of the experience of being women in an essentially patriarchal society. And although she's probably a little early for this time period, it's very hard for me to resist putting Frida Kahlo there, because of course Frida Kahlo took the most intensely personal emotions and put them on public display. And while these self-portraits are only about a third of her ultimate body of work, they're the ones everyone reacts to immediately, because they are the most intensely, I'm gonna keep saying personal tonight, but I'm trying to stay on schedule, so hopefully you'll forgive me, works that can be imagined. This one I find particularly moving, and it's completed after her miscarriage at the Henry Ford Hospital, where she's laying there processing what's happened to her, and her willingness to expose her pain, and ultimately what will become a statement of solidarity that makes so many other individuals able to connect with her, is I think part of what's made her such an iconic force today, although, you know, Salma Hayek also maybe contributed. And Tracey Emin is a great example of a more recent artist to do this. And one of my favorite pieces that I've had more students despair of over the years than possibly any other is the piece known as My Bed, which for many years was at the Saatchi Gallery before it was bought by the owner of the White Cube Galleries, and I don't know if he keeps it in his house. I'm not quite sure what you would do with that in your home. But My Bed, of course, is a piece of art where she has reproduced her bed with stained laundry, empty alcohol bottles, a couple of old condoms, and some cigarette packs to describe the mess that was her personal life during a period of depression and self-loathing. And one of the most fascinating things about this piece, and one of the reasons, frankly, I wish it were being shown publicly, is that having had the pleasure to see it when it was on display at the Saatchi, there's nothing like walking through an art gallery and watching other people walk past a bed with literally someone's dirty laundry on display, and everyone trying not to be the one staring at the dirty bed with the stained underwear and the empty gin bottle. And I think the idea of how personal it is by the very fact that other gallery attendees shy away from it is absolutely conveyed, because no one wants to be the voyeuristic one peering in at Tracey Emin's personal life. But again, she's dealing with issues of sexuality, depression, stereotypes of women. There's a wadded up pair of nylons on the floor. It's an intensely intimate piece. So the last two pieces I want to talk about before we return to the wonderfulness that is Jessica Caldas, who I so wish could have been with us tonight, are pieces by I always want to say Iranian, but most individuals I know who are Iranian prefer to identify as Persian. So we'll call her a blend of the two. Monir Shahrudi Farmadian, excuse me. And one of the things that's incredible about her work is that she's very much a part of decolonizing the art world. And one of the things we've seen with women is that there's been a new appreciation, just like there has been of quilting, of traditional crafting that was not viewed as fine art by the West in the colonial settings in which the first sort of global encyclopedic museum collections were gathered. And Shahrudi is absolutely part of a tradition of mere mosaics that comes out of Iran, particularly in some of the most important Shia Islamic shrines, that she has turned into abstract work in the most modern sense of the word. And as a woman who's created these pieces and blended them into the modern art world, perhaps you can see the traditional protection from the evil eye mixed in there as well. She sort of reappropriated traditional artwork and put it on a par in the finest galleries with other things instead of being tucked away in the anthropology section for being a non-Western artist. Unfortunately, just about 2 years ago, passing away is another one of my absolute favorite artists, Hung Yu, who was a Chinese-American artist who spoke widely about her experience as an immigrant, and particularly the stories of women that were unknown in Chinese history and across borders. The 7 Poses series is a representation of old photographs of women who were courtesans, which she then screen printed and painted. And the idea of the circles for her are examples of infinity. And these nameless women captured in old black and white photos for her were stories that were being retold and honored by a new generation of women. And this idea of taking a piece of a past and bringing it into galleries and defying, I think, nationality, gender, class, and race. We're crossing every intersection now. Hung Liu's work is pretty breathtaking. And again, as with most fairly abstract pieces, it's hard to do on a projector screen. But that is a complaint for another day, I suppose. Anyhow, Jessica Caldas has taken our 3 strands, and in the best tradition of the late 20th century and early 21st century artists, I think she's woven those strands, braided those strands into something truly exceptional. I am so grateful to the Maitland Art and History Center for bringing her work. I'm so grateful to Jessica Caldas for creating her work. And this notion that the personal is political, I hope resonates with you as you tour through it, because her personal story of survival has led this exhibit to ring so many chords with individuals who've had similar experiences as women of vulnerability to things like body norms that are oppressive, to things like assault, to various forms of violence. And it also offers so many incredible joys associated with gender in the vibrancy of the colors, the incredible strands of pearls in the entryway, those warm relationships with the other women in her life, and the incredible creative power that she owns of producing the textile works that she does in these tired bodies. So I want to thank you for letting me share some of my favorites. I'm hoping I'm not completely beyond the pale with time. I think I've just about exactly made it, because we have to give you a chance to question and answer before heading over to the gallery, or should we do questions in the gallery?
What would you prefer? I mean, I think we should maybe take 3 or 4 questions
Sure.
here, and then we can go to the gallery, yeah.
But yes, thank you all for coming out on a Wednesday night. Yeah.
Going back to Artisima,
Mm-hmm.
Artemisia,
Sure.
that trial of hers, what time period was this?
You're looking at the early 1600s. So the end of Renaissance and early Baroque Italy transition there.
And they put thumb screws on it.
Honestly, it sounds miserable, but I don't recommend any of the early modern European forms of torture as anything that'd be judicially acceptable, I hope, today. But yes, she was tortured with thumb screws. And we have her testimony while being tortured, because nothing like thumb screws to guarantee accuracy. Any other questions? Yeah. Or if you don't want to put your hand up, that's okay. I know you were thinking about it.
Yeah, thinking about it. Okay, so going back to my bed, the artwork.
Sure.
I know you said that a lot of people didn't want to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
What would you think, like, would they be kind of not wanting to look at themselves in that artwork as well?
I think that's a fabulous question. I just know that when it's in the center of the room, people kind of walk past like this and kind of make their way to the next room. And it was the kind of thing you could honestly sit and watch for a while. But this is a dangerous proposition at the Saatchi. This was in about 2003. And they had a number of Dwayne Hansen sculptures. And of course, he has the frozen tourists and custodians. And I'm afraid I was sitting watching another piece, and a small child came and poked me while I wasn't paying attention. And I yelped, and the child yelped, and it was an awkward situation. So I'm probably glad I didn't sit and watch reactions to my bed for too long. So yeah, that's a great question. I don't know if they could have said exactly why, but I think part of it is there's something very intimate. I think even today, when it's someone you don't know well, you don't take them into their house and say, so come sit on my bed. My unmade bed with my used underwear on it. It really is a statement. Yeah?
You went over a lot of significant barriers to entry for women in art
Sure.
throughout history. What do you think still exists today that really stopped? And it's a large conversation. But
Yes.
like something immediate that
I was gonna say, that's
exists.
another talk.
Something that exists today that still is absolutely a barrier that still exists.
Ooh, I think there are a lot of things. I think a lot of things that are barriers for women are barriers in a lot of professions that are barriers in the art world. And I think barriers, sort of Venn diagram between barriers for artists, because it's hard to be a full-time artist who can survive financially, right? Just producing art. And then on top of that, when you add the fact that that women so often are single parents, or women are so often taking on other family caretaker duties with financial associations. If you look at the pay difference that still exists across professions, if you look at the problems with family relationships, I mean, as a woman who's been through graduate program, I can tell you how many women leave those programs for family issues, and those aren't including a high-powered art career. I also think, though, that art is a difficult, well, and actually we have artists in the room who could correct me on this, but I think it's a particularly difficult profession to move ahead in if you're not able to do a lot of the informal promotion and networking, and I think that's very hard to do with caretaking responsibilities in your life. And often careers that require that sort of networking can be very difficult for women to break into. But there are certainly people who would be better, female artists in the audience, and male artists, and I'm sure non-binary artists as well, who can speak about some of the challenges much better than I can, because as a historian, I have the joy of a more stable profession and the limitations of it. So I think it's difficult.
Can I mention one thing about that?
Absolutely.
When we began the conversation with, when I began the conversations with Jessica about how, for me, her story was inseparable from her art. She had made it, like on several times mentioned that in the past, that was exactly what certain curators wanted to do. So I think it's kind of like, it's a lot easier to package something for consumption when you divorce a story from it. You know what I mean? It becomes more of a package and a product and commodity.
Sure.
And a lot of people have to think like that. I'm really proud of A&H that we don't think like that here. But it was interesting for her because I saw them as inseparable. But I think, like this gentleman asked, there's a lot of women artists that I know, personally, that the story for them is completely ingrained in the why and the how of what they do. And often when they get into the gallery systems, that wants to be pried apart.
I think that actually goes back to your question about Tracy Emin too. I think people are sometimes scared to look at other people's personal lives. And I think that's why the personal being political is such a shocking statement for someone. Because it's easy to say, this is what's going on in my relationship with a parent, or my relationship with a lover, or my relationship with my job. But to see yourself as part of a wider systemic issue is something that we're discouraged from doing, right? And it's a little bit shocking for some people. So I think that's what makes Caldas work so special and so radical. And yeah, certainly the Art History Center for promoting it. And I hope this has shown that there's a trend on the part of female artists to do that, which I absolutely admire.
Picking back on that, I'm curious because you had spoken a little bit to sort of the side eye that Western established art community gives to non-colonial art based or women's art, especially based on what is traditionally has been craft work.
Yeah.
On the conceptual side, personally, I feel that there's a little bit of that similar attitude towards narrative art or art that leans on storytelling
Sure.
You know, go through again, seeing it as more craft work or that more kind of more indigenous, you know, oral traditions and things. I've noticed that a lot of the artists that you selected for this presentation are very emotional. There's
Yeah.
very lyric as well. I wasn't sure how intentional that was, or if you had more to say on that.
I think that's the same thing that Dan pointed to. I think that's idea that I was looking for the artists, and there are so many artists that come immediately to mind in women in art. Some of the most important have been people who've tapped into their personal narratives. And I think it's interesting that male artists have really been discouraged from doing that. One of the things that it's interesting to think of is that, and I truly believe, is that when you add as many viewpoints as possible to the dialogue gets richer. And I hope that that creates a space also where male artists can share those intensely personal emotions and break down those boundaries in their work. Because I think women's lives have been so wrapped up in the struggle to be, because there's a struggle to be an artist, there's this sort of entwining of the personal and professional and political that men don't always necessarily, I don't know if they don't experience or they don't articulate the experience. They don't think of the experience in the same way. And I think part of that comes with that real traditional academy training, right? That these are separate worlds. And I hope this opens that up, because it is emotional intimacy is the only term I can think for it. And it creates some really powerful art that is, I think, universally appealing, because it speaks to the most sort of common elements of human nature, right? Like some gut that we all have. Back to Jessica Caldas, this beautiful like pink silk viscera in the other room. But I think that the best art is full of something that everyone feels. And so I think that the personal and political makes an incredibly gripping subject matter. And it's interesting because, you know, as humanities professor, as a history professor, you look at art in the context of its time. But the things that are sometimes popular in the 1700s and the 1500s, those aren't always the things we care about today. Some of the things that are popular today were not popular at the time, but they spoke to something deeper, so that instead of being forgotten, the things that were bestsellers were like, yeah, no one cares about that anymore. I care about this, that, or the other. Like we were looking at some gorgeous Dürer watercolors that he really just did for himself out in nature, and everyone was like, these are so breathtaking, and he was like, those are my throwaways. And so I think that some of the times we look back on works and they really appeal to us, it's because there's something universal that defies the specific context of time or place or one individual's experience. So I hope that trend continues, but they're on the path to that happening here, I guess. So thank you, Maitland.